Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Dark Fears family. Tonight, we're diving deep into the shadows of the Appalachian wilderness, into stories that are as chilling as the coldest mountain nights. Have you ever felt like you were being watched by something that shouldn't exist? Something human, but not quite. I remember hiking alone near a forgotten trail, the fog creeping through the trees like ghostly fingers. Every snap of a twig sounded like a warning. Then, out of nowhere, I caught a glimpse of a figure, twisted, pale, and wild, watching me from the shadows. Its eyes, they weren't normal. They burned with something feral, something that belonged to the dark corners of the Appalachian hills. Tonight, we bring you 8 new, most disturbing true Appalachia feral people encounters. Real stories from people who face the unimaginable. Stay close, keep your lights on, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit that notification bell. Because what you're about to hear may haunt you long after the video ends. My name is Daniel, and this happened when I was 22, on a solo backpacking trip through the remote hills of Appalachia. I had always loved the thrill of being alone in the wilderness, far from roads, phones, and people. But that summer, the forest felt different. The air was heavier, almost suffocating, and the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was tense, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I had set up camp in a small clearing near a creek, thinking it would be safe for the night. As dusk fell, the shadows stretched unnaturally long, and I thought I heard movement just beyond the firelight. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but no wind. At first, I dismissed it as wildlife, maybe a deer or raccoon. But then I saw it. A figure crouched low near the tree line. Its posture was unnatural, almost animal-like. Its face was hidden, but the faint glint of eyes reflected the dying firelight. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I realized then that this wasn't just someone lost in the woods. Something feral was watching me, and it was patient, waiting for me to make a mistake. I sat frozen, heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, yet I could feel it observing every flicker of the fire. I whispered to myself, trying to convince myself it was just a hiker or a lost camper. But something in the way it crouched, almost like a predator, made my stomach turn. I remembered an old local legend. Feral people, descendants of those who vanished into the mountains generations ago, living off the land and avoiding outsiders at all costs. I had laughed at the stories before, but laughter deserted me now. Every sound seemed amplified. A branch snapped behind me, and I jerked toward it. Nothing. Then came the low, guttural hum, almost like someone trying to imitate an animal's growl. My hands shook as I fumbled with my backpack, trying to grab my flashlight. The beam caught its eyes again, wide, unblinking, reflecting the orange glow of the fire. I whispered, "Who's there?" No answer, just the oppressive silence of the forest. My mind screamed to run, but instinct told me running might trigger a chase. The night had begun, and I realized the forest wasn't empty. Something was stalking me. I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself I needed a plan. Slowly, I crawled toward my tent, flashlight trembling in hand. The figure didn't move, it just watched. Every instinct screamed danger, but I couldn't bring myself to run blindly. My mind raced. Maybe if I appeared non-threatening, it would leave. I whispered my name, hoping to humanize myself. "I'm Daniel. No harm." The forest seemed to respond with silence, the kind that presses on your ears, making each heartbeat deafening. Then suddenly, I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps circling my fire. Not fast, not like an animal, but slow, measured, and deliberate. I ducked behind my backpack, clutching my knife, but I couldn't see much. The shadows were playing tricks on me, but I swore I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees, long limbs, hunched posture, almost too quick to follow with the eye. I realized the figure was no ordinary person. Its presence radiated a raw, animalistic intelligence. Something that had lived here, hidden in these hills, unseen by the world, and it was aware of me. I knew I had to make a move. Staying put felt like an invitation. Slowly, I packed essentials, keeping my eyes fixed on the dark shapes between the trees. Every sound, the crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made me flinch. My pulse felt like it would burst through my chest. Then I heard it, a soft, guttural whisper, almost human, but distorted. "Daniel," it said. My blood ran cold. How did it know my name? I hadn't said it aloud. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed my flashlight, shining it wildly toward the trees. The light caught the figure again, and I finally saw its face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and ragged hair. Its mouth twisted in a grin, teeth jagged and broken, a grotesque mimic of humanity. It didn't run. It didn't speak again. It just crouched there watching. I stumbled backward toward my tent, trying to convince myself I could outpace it. But instinct screamed that this creature had been living here longer than I could imagine. Long enough to know every sound, every shadow, every weakness. I finally zipped up my backpack, praying it hadn't heard the noise. Slowly, I backed toward the trail, every nerve screaming. The forest seemed alive, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. Each step I took was mirrored by soft, deliberate footfalls. Never fast, never chasing, just following. I tried calling for help, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hello? Anyone there?" Silence, except for that soft, chilling repetition of my name. "Daniel. Daniel." It wasn't distant. It felt like it was moving closer without moving at all. I stumbled into a small clearing, the moonlight barely visible through the thick canopy. I could feel it, standing at the edge of the clearing, its eyes fixed on me. I tried to reason, to think logically, but nothing about this creature was logical. I gripped my knife tightly, knowing I had to survive the night. Somewhere in the shadows, a low, guttural chuckle echoed, a sound that didn't belong to any human I had ever known. I realized I wasn't alone in these woods, and that leaving alive would be far harder than I imagined. Every step forward was agony. My feet hurt, my lungs burned, but fear gave me unnatural strength. I kept glancing over my shoulder, always the same figure, crouched, moving silently, unbroken by branches or leaves. The sound of the wind through the trees couldn't mask its presence. It was like the forest itself was alive with its intention. Then it spoke again, more clearly this time, a voice ragged and broken. "You shouldn't be here." The words were barely human, twisted with some feral cadence that set my teeth on edge. My skin crawled, goosebumps erupting across my body. I remembered an old story a ranger once told me. These Appalachian feral people were the descendants of families who had disappeared decades ago, living completely off the land, avoiding towns, and sometimes hunting anyone foolish enough to wander too deep. I shivered. I wasn't just a hiker now, I was prey. Branches cracked behind me, closer this time. I spun around, flashlight shaking violently, but saw only shadows stretching impossibly long. Somewhere, a guttural laugh echoed, and I knew the night was far from over. Panic clawed at my chest. I ran blindly through the underbrush, stumbling over roots and rocks. My flashlight bounced wildly, casting grotesque shadows on twisted tree trunks. Every step seemed to echo unnaturally, and I swore I could hear something moving above me in the canopy. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a branch snapping. Close. I whipped around, and for a split second, I saw it leaping toward me with terrifying agility. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its movements more animal than human. I dove behind a fallen log, knife clutched like a lifeline. The creature didn't give chase immediately. It circled low to the ground, growling softly, almost enjoying the game. My mind raced. I needed a plan, a place to hide or a way to scare it off. But the forest offered no refuge. Every shadow felt like it was watching me, every rustle a threat. Then, from the darkness, a guttural hiss filled the air. And I realized the hunter wasn't just toying with me. It had been tracking me for hours, learning my every movement. My lungs burned as I forced myself to crawl toward a denser part of the forest. The underbrush tore at my clothes, branches slapping my face, but I didn't dare stop. Every instinct screamed that I was being hunted, that this was no ordinary human. Then I found a shallow cave, barely large enough to crouch in. I slipped inside, holding my breath, hoping the darkness would conceal me. Outside, I could hear it moving, sniffing, testing my presence. Its low, guttural growls reverberated through the trees, and I realized it wasn't just feral. It was cunning, intelligent, and patient. Minutes felt like hours. I could see nothing, only feel the vibrations of its presence. Then, silence. Too deep, too heavy. I dared a peek outside. The figure had vanished, leaving only the faint outline of disturbed leaves. My relief was short-lived. I knew it wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching, calculating. I whispered a prayer, clutching my knife, knowing that sleep would be impossible. This creature didn't just live here. It owned these woods, and I was an intruder in its realm. Hours passed. My body was numb, muscles cramping, but fear kept me alert. I dared not make a sound, listening to every snap, rustle, and distant howl. The forest felt alive, but not with wind or wildlife. It was alive with the presence of that thing. Then I heard it again, a soft, deliberate tapping on rocks near the cave. Tap, tap, tap. My heart froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, the world felt completely still. Then came a whisper, unmistakable, crawling into my mind. You can't hide. I realized something terrifying. It wasn't just tracking my body. It was reading me, understanding my fear, toying with it. I had to escape, but every route I considered was covered by trees and shadows. I made a decision. When it moved, I would run straight through the forest, hoping my instincts would be faster than its cunning. I bolted, running blindly into the forest, knife in hand. The figure followed, silent at first, then gradually increasing in pace. Branches tore at my face, roots tripped me, but adrenaline carried me forward. I didn't look back. Suddenly, I broke through the tree line and found the old hiking trail. My legs screamed in protest, but I ran faster than I thought possible. When I glanced back, I saw nothing, just shadows twisting in the moonlight. Had it given up? I didn't wait to find out. I stumbled into a ranger station hours later, breathless, covered in cuts and dirt. The rangers looked at me like I was crazy when I told them what I had seen. No one believed me, except for one old man who muttered, "They don't like strangers." You were lucky to get out, even now, years later. I can't forget the feeling of those hollow eyes in the dark, watching, waiting. Sometimes, when I hike alone, I swear I hear the faint rustle of branches behind me. And I remember that I was never truly alone in those woods. My name is Emily, and this happened during a weekend getaway with friends in the remote Appalachians. I had always loved exploring abandoned cabins and old homesteads, imagining the stories they held. But nothing could have prepared me for what I would find in that hollowed-out cabin. We had parked miles from the nearest road, our laughter echoing through the dense forest as we approached the structure. At first glance, it looked deserted, worn by decades of storms and neglect. But as we stepped closer, I noticed the subtle signs of recent habitation. A crude fire pit with ashes still warm, scraps of food, and odd markings etched into the walls, symbols I couldn't decipher but felt ominous. That night, I stayed alone while my friends slept in the nearby tents. I remember hearing soft footsteps outside the cabin, circling, deliberate and rhythmic. Shadows danced against the wooden walls as a cold breeze blew through the broken windows, carrying whispers I couldn't understand. Then I saw it. A figure hunched near the tree line, eyes glinting in the firelight. It wasn't human, not entirely. It watched me, patient and waiting. My heart hammered. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the firelight, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But the eyes didn't move like an animal's. They were fixed, unblinking, watching. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. As the night deepened, I felt a pressure in the air, heavy and suffocating. Every creak of the cabin floor sounded like footsteps approaching. Then came the soft scraping of something against the wooden walls, slow, deliberate enough to suggest intelligence. I whispered my friends' names, hoping they were awake, but there was no answer. Panic clawed at my chest. I picked up a piece of broken wood from the floor, holding it like a weapon, and edged toward the window. The figure had vanished, but I knew it hadn't left. Then I heard it, a low, guttural hiss, followed by a barely audible whisper, "You shouldn't be here." My stomach churned. This was no ordinary trespasser. Something human in form, but feral in nature, was watching me, studying me, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I decided to hide in the corner, clutching the broken wood tightly. The wind rattled the windows, and the shadows outside seemed to shift unnaturally. I could hear breathing, not my own, but slow, deliberate, uneven. Someone, or something, was inside the trees, circling the cabin. Minutes felt like hours. I tried to calm myself, whispering my own name repeatedly to anchor my mind. Then I noticed movement near the doorway. A silhouette crouched low, limbs long and twisted, its head tilted unnaturally, as if it were observing my every move. I realized I was trapped. Any attempt to run would be noticed. My mind raced. Could I make it to the tents without being seen? Or would it follow me, silent and cunning, hunting like a predator through the forest? The creature didn't advance. It just lingered, a dark, hulking shadow against the night. I felt its intelligence, its calculation, its awareness of me. The forest itself seemed complicit, shadows stretching to hide it, leaves rustling in anticipation. I slowly crept toward the broken window, trying to peer outside without drawing attention. That's when I saw more than one figure. 3, maybe 4, moving in the shadows with silent precision. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the moonlight in a way that made them appear otherworldly. I realized they weren't just watching. They were planning. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move without being detected. I could feel their focus on me. Like a predator stalking prey, it knows it can overpower. I crouched lower, trying to make myself as small as possible. My hand trembled over the broken wood. The forest seemed alive, pressing in from all sides, every shadow and rustle a possible threat. I remembered old legends of feral people in Appalachia. Families driven into hiding centuries ago, living completely off the land, hostile to anyone who stumbled into their territory. A branch snapped near the cabin. One of the figures shifted closer, and I finally saw its face. Pale, twisted, with jagged teeth and hollow eyes. My heart hammered, and I realized I wasn't just being observed. I was being hunted. I knew I had to move. Staying meant certain danger. I waited until the figures seemed distracted, then silently slipped out the back, hugging the shadows. The forest was alive with sounds. Leaves crunching underfoot, distant hoots, and that constant awareness that something feral was tracking me. I stumbled over roots and rocks, heart pounding with every step. The figures followed, their movements silent but precise. My mind raced. Where could I go that they couldn't follow? Every clearing, every open space felt like a trap. Then I saw it, an overgrown path leading downhill toward the creek. If I could reach the water, I might lose them, blend into the sounds of flowing water and escape. My body screamed in protest, muscles cramping, lungs burning, but adrenaline surged through me, driving me forward. From the trees behind me, I heard the softest of growls, almost human, almost animal. I dared not look back. The shadows of those feral beings stretched toward me like claws, patient, intelligent, and merciless. The creek appeared, shimmering faintly under the moonlight. I slid down the bank, hoping the water's sound would mask my movements. But the feeling of being watched didn't fade. The figures stayed at the tree line, their eyes glinting, calculating, like they were anticipating my every move. I paused to catch my breath, pressing my back against a rock, listening to the water rush past. For a moment, it seemed I might have lost them. Relief was fleeting. Then came a soft whistle, almost melodic, but twisted, an eerie lullaby that made my skin crawl. I recognized it as a lure, a predator calling prey out into the open. I had no choice. I had to keep moving, upstream along the bank, hoping the uneven terrain would slow them or mislead them. Every step was agony, my fear a constant pulse driving me forward. Through the dark, I glimpsed one of them closer, crouched low like a shadow taking form. Its hollow eyes bore into me, and I realized that these weren't random encounters. They were deliberate, intelligent, and patient hunters. I climbed over slippery rocks, water splashing over my boots, and tried to stay silent. Behind me, I could hear the soft, almost imperceptible crunch of leaves, their hunting rhythm. It wasn't fear that kept me going. It was sheer instinct, survival instinct. Then, I stumbled into a small clearing. Moonlight spilled through the canopy, illuminating an old hunting shack. It was dilapidated, but I thought it might provide temporary refuge. I slipped inside, holding my breath, listening. The sound of footsteps outside grew closer, slower now, deliberate. From the shadows, one of them appeared at the doorway, a grotesque silhouette, hunched with elongated limbs and jagged teeth. Its head tilted unnaturally as it studied me, and I could sense an intelligence that made my stomach knot. I pressed against the wall, knife trembling in hand. There was no way out without confrontation. I realized these beings weren't just wild, they were cunning, territorial, and they had been watching me for hours, learning my habits, predicting my moves. I stayed perfectly still, heart hammering. The creature at the doorway didn't move immediately. Then, slowly, it stepped aside, revealing another figure crouched just beyond, its glowing eyes fixated on me. I realized with horror that they had surrounded the shack, using the shadows as cover. I considered my options. Fight, flee, or wait. Fighting seemed futile. I decided to wait for the right moment, breathing shallowly, counting in my head to remain calm. The night stretched, each second an eternity. Suddenly, a twig snapped near the back entrance. I didn't move. One of the figures shifted, almost imperceptibly, tilting its head, listening, calculating. The air was heavy with anticipation, the forest holding its breath. I realized something terrifying. They were communicating in ways I couldn't understand. Their patience was deliberate. They weren't acting on instinct. They were strategizing, intelligent predators in a world where I was the intruder. I pressed my back against the wall, clutching my knife, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Minutes later, the figures retreated into the shadows, silent, almost teasing me. I waited, unsure if this was a trick, a test, or if they had lost interest. My mind raced. I knew they hadn't left. Appalachia was their domain, and I was still trapped. I gathered courage, deciding to slip out and make a break for the tents. The forest was uneven, overgrown, but I moved as quietly as I could, hugging the shadows. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch. Every branch felt like a warning. Then one of them appeared suddenly, lunging from a tree with unnatural agility. I screamed, tripping over a root and falling into the underbrush. Its hollow eyes bore into me for a moment before it paused, tilting its head as if amused. Then, silently, it disappeared. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline surging. I realized I was lucky to survive this encounter, and luck alone wouldn't be enough if I stayed in the hollow. I ran blindly toward the tents, collapsing in front of my friends, shaking and gasping for breath. My story seemed unbelievable, and they looked at me in horror and disbelief. I could still feel the weight of those hollow eyes in the back of my mind. The next morning, we searched the area around the cabin. There was no trace of the figures, no footprints, nothing. Just the burned-out remnants of the fire pit and the carved symbols on the walls. My friends didn't want to return, and neither did I. Even now, years later, I sometimes hike in the Appalachians. On quiet nights, I swear I hear whispers, a rustling in the trees, or see fleeting shadows with glowing eyes. Those feral people aren't just legends. They are real, cunning, and patient. They watch, wait, and remember. I will never forget that night in the hollow cabin. I learned the hard way that some places in the Appalachian wilderness aren't meant for outsiders. Some shadows belong entirely to the forest. My name is Marcus, and this happened when I was driving alone through a remote stretch of Appalachia. I had taken a detour off the main highway to explore some old logging roads, thinking it would be an adventure. Little did I know, the road I chose led me straight into a nightmare. It was late afternoon when I noticed the first sign. A ramshackle cabin half hidden in the trees, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. No one was around, and the road ahead seemed to vanish into dense forest. I thought about turning back, but curiosity and stubbornness pushed me forward. As the sun dipped below the hills, shadows lengthened, stretching across the road in unnatural shapes. That's when I saw them. Figures crouched in the tree line, watching. At first, I thought they were locals or hunters, but their movements were too silent, too deliberate, almost predatory. Something about the way they stared, their heads tilting unnaturally, made my stomach twist. I could feel their attention, as if they knew I didn't belong there, and that the road I was on was no longer mine. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just shadows in my imagination. But as I continued down the winding dirt road, movement caught my eye. More figures appeared, crouched low, slipping silently between trees. Their pale skin glinted faintly in the dying light, and their eyes, hollow, unblinking, locked onto me. I sped up, heart pounding. But the road seemed endless, twisting unnaturally, like the forest was reshaping itself around me. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw them closer, watching, following. But when I blinked, there was nothing. I remembered old Appalachian legends about feral people who had retreated into the wilderness generations ago. They were said to be cunning, patient, and territorial. I had laughed at the stories before, but now I knew the truth. The sun set completely, plunging the forest into darkness. My headlights cut through the night, but shadows stretched beyond their reach. Somewhere ahead, I saw a flicker of movement, an abandoned road sign swinging in the wind. I realized that I wasn't just lost. I was being stalked. The forest alive with the presence of something human. And something else. Panic set in. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white, trying to remember every detail of the road I had taken. But everything looked unfamiliar. The forest had swallowed any landmarks. The figures didn't move like normal humans. They seemed to glide silently through the underbrush, always staying just out of the light. Then I saw the first movement closer. A figure crouched low near the roadside, watching me with a twisted, calculating expression. Its limbs were elongated, its movements unnatural. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, but the wheels slipped on loose gravel, the car skidding slightly as branches scraped against the windows. I tried calling someone on my phone. No signal, nothing but dead silence, broken by the occasional crack of a branch or the distant rustle of leaves. The forest itself seemed to pulse with life, alive with these feral watchers. I realized with horror that these weren't random creatures. They were intelligent, territorial, and patient. They had been waiting for someone to wander too far off the main roads. And now, that someone was me. I knew I had to escape. I kept my eyes on the road, weaving through trees and ruts, every instinct screaming that these figures were closing in. Then I saw it. A branch snapped directly in front of the headlights, and a pale, twisted figure lunged out of the darkness. I swerved violently, barely avoiding it. My heart raced, the engine screaming as I tried to put as much distance as possible between me and the tree line. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, fleeting glimpses of more figures emerging, their hollow eyes reflecting the dim light of my headlights. I could feel them tracking me, silent hunters moving with unnatural precision. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, but not far enough. It was as if the forest itself conspired with them, masking their presence until they chose to reveal it. Every mile felt like an eternity. I tried to convince myself this was a nightmare, but the weight of their gaze pressed in on me. One wrong move, one glance to the side, and I knew I wouldn't make it out alive. I forced myself to keep going, heart hammering, adrenaline surging. I passed an old stone bridge, its surface cracked and overgrown. Shadows flitted along the edges, and I swore one of the figures leaped onto the road ahead. But when I blinked, it was gone. The wind through the trees sounded like whispers, low and guttural, almost human, almost a warning. I tried rationalizing. Maybe it was a hiker or a hunter, but every instinct screamed otherwise. These weren't normal people. Their movements, their patience, their intelligence. They were predators, adapted to the forest over generations, invisible until they chose to reveal themselves. Then I saw the clearing ahead, a small abandoned gas station, flickering light above the pump. Relief surged through me. Maybe here I could stop, catch my breath, call for help. But as I approached, movement in the tree line caught my eye. Two figures crouched low, staring at me, their hollow eyes reflecting the weak light. I realized that no matter how far I drove, the forest had its hunters. And tonight, I had stumbled into their territory. Escape would be nothing short of a miracle. I parked hastily, leaving the engine running, and stepped out to scan the area. The wind carried the faint rustle of branches, the soft but deliberate footfalls of something, or multiple somethings, moving in the shadows. I clutched a tire iron, my only weapon, hoping it would be enough if one of them came close. A third figure appeared, emerging from the side of the station, hunched, pale, and grotesque. Its head tilted unnaturally as it observed me. I froze, heart hammering, realizing I had no chance if I engaged. My only hope was to run, but the forest around the station was thick and unwelcoming. Suddenly, a guttural hiss echoed from the tree line. I leapt back toward the car, fumbling with the keys, my hands slick with sweat. The figures moved silently, circling, calculating, waiting for me to make a fatal mistake. I knew with certainty that this was no random encounter. The feral people of Black Hollow weren't just legends. They were real, intelligent, and deadly. And tonight, they had chosen me as their prey. I scrambled into the car, slamming the door shut. My hands shook as I started the engine, tires spinning on gravel. The figures didn't immediately approach, but lingered at the tree line, their eyes fixed on me. I realized they weren't blind. They were calculating, waiting to see how I would escape. I slammed the car into reverse, then sped forward, tires throwing gravel, engine screaming. The forest seemed to warp around me, the road twisting unnaturally. I could feel their presence flanking me, invisible but persistent, like shadows with intent. Branches whipped against the windows, scraping the metal, and I caught fleeting glimpses of elongated limbs and pale faces. Each glance in the rearview mirror made my stomach knot. The figures didn't chase like normal animals. They anticipated, predicted my movements, hunting with patience and intelligence. I pushed forward, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and the tree line. But I knew, deep down, they wouldn't let me leave unscathed. Black Hollow had claimed many before me, and I was learning the hard way that curiosity and ignorance were deadly mistakes in these mountains. The clearing ahead opened to a narrow bridge over a swollen creek. I floored the accelerator, hoping the rough terrain would slow anyone following me. But in the reflection of the headlights on the water, I saw them. 3 figures poised on the banks, crouched, watching, moving in perfect synchronization. The forest seemed to pulse with their presence, shadows stretching unnaturally, leaves rustling as if whispering secrets. I realized I was being tested, every movement I made calculated, every breath observed. One wrong step, one glance at the wrong time, and they could strike. A gust of wind carried the faintest whisper. "You can't escape." My blood ran cold. These were not animals, not even fully human. They were something else, a lineage of feral hunters, living unseen, adapting, observing, and eliminating intruders. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, heart racing. The bridge approached, narrow and rickety, but I had no choice. Forward was the only option, no matter the risk. I crossed the bridge carefully, tires squealing on worn wood. Behind me, the rustle of leaves intensified. I didn't dare glance back, fearing what I might see, but I could feel them tracking, calculating, waiting. Finally, the road widened, giving me a sense of hope. Maybe the darkness of the forest would lose interest. Maybe the highway ahead would save me. But just as I thought I was free, a figure emerged directly in front of the headlights, crouched low and impossibly fast. I slammed on the brakes, tires skidding on gravel. The figure's hollow eyes reflected the beams of my headlights, twisted in a grotesque grin. It didn't attack, not yet. Instead, it tilted its head, a silent predator evaluating me, testing my fear. I realized then the horrifying truth. These feral people weren't just hunters. They were patient, calculating, and territorial. Their existence was hidden from the world, but anyone who strayed too far into their domain would become prey, no matter how fast they ran or how clever they thought they were. I finally reached the main highway as dawn broke, the figures vanishing into the shadows of the forest. My hands were raw, knuckles bruised from gripping the wheel, body trembling from adrenaline. The road ahead was clear, but the weight of the encounter pressed on me. Even now, years later, I remember the hollow eyes, the unnatural movements, the patience and intelligence of those feral hunters. They are real, living hidden in the Appalachian wilderness, and their patience is terrifying. I sometimes wonder how many others have wandered into Black Hollow and never returned. How many have glimpsed those pale, twisted figures and never escaped to tell the tale? The forest keeps its secrets, and its hunters guard them fiercely. I survived that night, but I carry it with me. The sound of rustling leaves, the faint hiss of warning, the feeling of being watched. Some places aren't meant for strangers. Some shadows belong entirely to the forest. My name is Hannah, and this happened when I decided to hike alone along an old trail in the Appalachians, known locally as Whispering Ridge. I had heard rumors of strange sightings and eerie sounds, but I thought they were just stories to scare tourists. I was wrong. The trail was narrow, flanked by dense trees that blocked most of the fading sunlight. Birds had gone silent, and the air felt heavy, almost alive. I kept hearing faint whispers, like my name being carried by the wind. But when I stopped and listened closely, there was no one around. About 2 miles in, I noticed movement in the tree line. Pale figures crouched low, limbs unnaturally long, gliding silently between the trees. Their hollow eyes reflected the dim sunlight, following my every step. My heart pounded, but I told myself it was imagination, until I saw the first symbol etched into a tree. It was crude, almost primitive, but carried an unsettling intent. I realized then that these weren't mere wanderers or hunters. These were the feral people of Appalachia, secretive, intelligent, and territorial. And I had wandered straight into their domain. I tried to stay calm, moving quietly along the trail. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me flinch. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, stalked by eyes that never blinked, limbs that moved unnaturally, silently. The whispers grew louder, almost forming words, but I couldn't understand them. It was as if the forest itself was speaking to me, warning me to leave or threatening me. I noticed more symbols etched into tree trunks, some deep enough to leave splinters, forming strange patterns I had never seen before. Suddenly, I heard a soft, guttural hiss from behind a cluster of trees. My heart skipped a beat. One of them had emerged, crouched low, its elongated limbs moving with eerie grace. I froze, not daring to move, realizing that any sudden action could provoke it. I understood then that these feral people weren't just territorial, they were predators. They observed, calculated, and waited. I had wandered into a hunting ground hidden in plain sight, and the shadows were alive with intent. I decided to keep moving, but my pace was slow, deliberate, as though the trail itself resisted my passage. Every step felt monitored. The whispers shifted into low murmurs, almost human in tone, sending chills down my spine. Then I saw them. Two figures emerging from the underbrush. They crouched low, elongated limbs bent at odd angles, heads tilting unnaturally. Their hollow eyes reflected faint sunlight, piercing through the canopy. I tried to remain invisible, pressing myself against a tree, hoping they wouldn't notice me. One of the figures stepped closer, examining the symbols I had passed. It tilted its head, almost inquisitive, before moving along, silent as the shadows themselves. My breath caught. They weren't mindless. They were intelligent, territorial, and aware of every step I took. I realized that escape required strategy, not speed. If I ran recklessly, I would be cornered. I needed to blend, to anticipate, to understand how these feral people moved and communicated. For the first time, fear wasn't enough. I needed focus. Survival depended on it. I continued along the ridge, heart hammering, senses on high alert. The forest seemed alive. Every rustle, shadow, and gust of wind amplified my fear. The whispers persisted, now interspersed with guttural hisses, soft enough to make me doubt my own hearing. Suddenly, movement to my left. A figure had emerged closer than I realized. Its posture was unnatural, almost predatory, crouched low to the ground. Its head tilted unnaturally, eyes fixed on me with an intelligence that was terrifying. I froze, calculating my next step. Every instinct screamed to run, but I knew that would trigger a chase. Instead, I slowed my breathing, stepping lightly, trying to make myself appear as part of the forest. The figure tilted its head, seemingly studying me, before disappearing into the shadows. I realized then that they were testing me, observing my behavior, assessing my threat level. These were not mindless creatures. They were cunning, patient, and relentless. The ridge was their territory, and I had violated it. The trail narrowed further, and the whispers grew louder, almost forming words, urging me to leave. I could hear movement to my right, a soft scraping of limbs against tree trunks. Careful, deliberate, calculated. I realized I was being flanked. I spotted more symbols etched into the bark, deeper and more intricate than before. They seemed almost ritualistic, a silent warning for anyone who wandered too far. Panic surged, but I forced myself to stay calm, moving as quietly as possible. Then I saw it. A figure, partially hidden in shadows, crouched low. Its pale, twisted face glimmered faintly, hollow eyes unblinking. Its limbs moved with unnatural grace, each step deliberate, silent. I understood that these feral people didn't rely on brute force. They relied on patience and terror. I pressed myself against the trees, barely breathing, hoping to become invisible. But the forest was alive with them, watching, studying, waiting. I had stumbled into their hunting ground, and every instinct screamed that one mistake could be my last. The trail curved steeply downward, and I had no choice but to follow. The whispers intensified, carrying a rhythm almost like a hunting chant. My heart raced, and I could feel eyes tracking every movement. A figure emerged directly ahead, blocking my path. I froze, gripping a broken branch as a weapon. Its face was pale, twisted, with hollow eyes and jagged teeth. It didn't move aggressively, but I could sense its awareness, its intelligence, its patient calculation. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on it. As I did, more figures appeared in the shadows behind, circling silently. The forest itself seemed to bend, shadows stretching unnaturally, hiding their presence until they chose to reveal it. I realized that this was not a mistake I could undo. The feral people of Whispering Ridge were territorial, cunning, and lethal. Survival required more than fear. It required wit, patience, and the ability to anticipate their next move. I slowly moved along the edge of the trail, trying to keep a natural rhythm, hoping the figures would lose interest. But they didn't. Their presence pressed in on me, patient, calculated, relentless. I realized then that the forest itself was an extension of them, every tree, shadow, and whisper working in concert. Suddenly, a guttural hiss echoed from the ridge above. One of them had climbed higher, watching, calculating. I knew it wasn't just observation, it was strategy. A silent predator ensuring my path led where they wanted. I paused, hiding behind a tree, trying to catch my breath. Every instinct screamed to flee. But I also understood that hasty movement would be fatal. I needed to outthink them, to move deliberately, blending with the forest, becoming part of the shadows. The whispers intensified, forming a rhythm, almost like they were marking my movement, anticipating my escape. I realized then that these feral people were not simply wild. They were intelligent, territorial, and ruthless. I continued cautiously, stepping lightly, following the narrow trail that wound through the dense trees. Every so often, I caught glimpses of pale figures flitting in the shadows, observing, studying, waiting. Their hollow eyes glimmered faintly, unblinking, a silent reminder that I was an intruder in their territory. The trail opened to a small clearing, but relief was fleeting. More symbols etched into the trees surrounded me, crude and ritualistic. I realized these markings were warnings, reminders of who controlled this land. A sudden movement to my right, a figure crouched low, limbs elongated, twisted head tilting unnaturally. It stared at me, evaluating, patient. Its presence sent a shiver down my spine. The others were somewhere in the shadows, coordinating silently, their patience terrifying. I pressed myself against the edge of the clearing, hoping to pass unnoticed. Every instinct screamed that one wrong step could lead to capture. The whispers surrounded me now, low and guttural, a haunting chorus that filled the ridge. I edged forward slowly, heart racing. The trail narrowed again, leading into an old stone bridge covered in moss and roots. I could feel them all around me now, shadows stretching unnaturally, whispers echoing off the rocks. Then one of them stepped into the open, crouched low on the bridge. Its pale, twisted face glimmered faintly, hollow eyes unblinking. It tilted its head, a silent predator assessing me, testing my fear. I held my ground, trying to remain calm, forcing myself to move deliberately, step by step. The forest seemed alive, watching, listening, manipulating. Every sound I made carried through the ridge. Every shadow could conceal another figure. I realized that the feral people of Whispering Ridge were not merely territorial. They were intelligent, patient, and terrifyingly aware of every movement. One misstep, one glance at the wrong time, and I would become prey. I tightened my grip on the branch I carried, preparing for whatever was to come, knowing that survival required both wit and courage. I finally reached the end of the trail as dusk turned to night, stepping onto a wider forest road leading back to civilization. The figures receded into the shadows, their hollow eyes fading, whispers dying down. My body trembled, adrenaline coursing through me. Even now, years later, I remember the hollow eyes, the calculated patience, the whispers, and the ritualistic symbols etched into trees. These feral people weren't just legends. They were real, cunning, and territorial, surviving hidden in the Appalachian wilderness. I sometimes wonder how many travelers wandered into Whispering Ridge and never returned, how many became part of the forest's dark secret. Every sound of wind through the trees, every rustle in the underbrush makes me uneasy, reminding me of the unseen hunters who still linger in the shadows. The ridge had spared me that day, but I learned a hard truth. Some places aren't meant for outsiders, and some shadows belong entirely to the forest. My name is Thomas, and this happened when my friends and I decided to spend a weekend hiking deep in the Appalachian wilderness. We had heard stories of abandoned cabins in Raven's Hollow, hidden far from any marked trails. We thought it would be an adventure, but it became a nightmare. The forest was thick, the air damp and heavy. As we approached the hollow, the sunlight dimmed beneath the dense canopy, casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. That's when I first noticed the cabin. It was old, decaying, with a sagging roof and windows that reflected nothing but darkness. Smoke didn't rise from the chimney, yet the smell of fire lingered faintly in the air. I stepped closer, heart pounding, and noticed scratches and crude symbols etched into the wooden walls. Something about them was unnerving, almost deliberate, like warnings left by someone or something that wanted us gone. Then I saw movement. Pale, emaciated figures darted between the trees, their hollow eyes fixed on us. They moved silently, gliding with unnatural grace, watching, waiting. My stomach dropped. These weren't just legends. They were real, and Raven's Hollow had chosen to make its presence known. We tried to convince ourselves it was just shadows, the tricks of light, or maybe other hikers playing pranks. But the forest felt alive, heavy with presence. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves was magnified. A warning, a signal that we weren't alone. I glanced at my friends, their faces pale and tense. One of them whispered about old legends, stories of feral people living deep in Appalachia, preying on intruders, using the forest itself as camouflage. I wanted to laugh, but the hollow eyes glinting from the tree line erased any humor. I stepped closer to the cabin, compelled by a mix of curiosity and dread. The symbols carved into the walls were strange, ritualistic, and primitive, almost alive in their intent. I could feel the forest watching, waiting for a mistake. Then movement caught my eye. Figures crouched in the shadows, observing, tilting their heads unnaturally, watching our every move. The air seemed to thicken, oppressive and suffocating. Raven's Hollow was no ordinary forest, and we had trespassed into territory we weren't meant to enter. As the sun dipped lower, the cabin seemed to grow more sinister. Shadows stretched unnaturally, elongating and twisting as if the forest itself was alive. The figures in the trees moved silently, their pale faces peering from behind trunks, eyes unblinking, observing. I tried calling out to my friends, but my voice caught in my throat. Any sudden noise might provoke them. I realized that these feral people were not mindless. They were patient, calculating, and aware of every move we made. A sudden rustle in the underbrush made me freeze. One of the figures emerged, crouched low, limbs elongated, moving with unnatural grace. It didn't attack immediately. Instead, it tilted its head, watching, evaluating, as if testing our reactions. The forest felt like a trap, every path twisting, every sound amplified. I realized that survival depended on awareness, stealth, and careful planning. Raven's Hollow wasn't just hiding its secrets, it was alive, hunting with silent predators embedded in every shadow. I motioned to my friends to stay close, whispering that we needed to retreat slowly. But as we turned, I noticed more movement. Figures emerging from the trees surrounding the cabin. Their eyes glowed faintly, hollow and unblinking, limbs bent in unnatural ways. The air was thick with tension, whispers echoing faintly as if the forest itself was speaking. We weren't dealing with ordinary humans. These feral people were predators, intelligent and territorial. I realized then that any sudden movement could spell disaster. One figure stepped closer, crouched, observing our every motion. Its face was twisted, pale, grotesque, almost human yet undeniably feral. I gripped a fallen branch tightly, knowing it wouldn't be enough. But I needed something to defend myself. The forest seemed to close in, shadows moving with intent, the trees bending and twisting as if alive. Raven's Hollow had claimed this land, and we were trespassers. The realization hit me. Escaping unscathed would require more than courage. It would require cunning, awareness, and perhaps a touch of luck. We edged backward cautiously, trying to make our retreat as silent as possible. The forest seemed to anticipate our movements. The figures mirrored us, always a step ahead, moving through shadows with silent precision. I noticed more symbols carved into the cabin's walls. Primitive, deliberate, almost ritualistic. Some appeared fresh, others old, hinting that these feral people had been here for generations. The forest was their domain, and the cabin was a warning to all intruders. Suddenly, one of the figures lunged from the shadows, limbs bent unnaturally, moving impossibly fast. We froze in terror as it stopped just short of us, tilting its head as if amused. The intelligence behind its gaze was horrifying. It knew we were prey, and it understood fear. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of guttural sounds that made my blood run cold. Each figure seemed to move with a calculated rhythm, coordinating silently. We weren't dealing with random intruders. We were being hunted. The forest itself had become a predator, and the cabin in Raven's Hollow was its heart. I motioned for my friends to follow me as we crept slowly toward the trailhead. The forest pressed in, shadows stretching unnaturally, every step echoing in the silence. The figures mirrored us, silent and patient, their presence felt rather than always seen. Branches scraped our shoulders as we moved, rustling leaves masking our sounds. But the figures seemed aware of every detail. It was like the forest itself had aligned with them, concealing their movements until the perfect moment. One figure appeared suddenly from the underbrush, crouched low, face twisted, hollow eyes reflecting the faint light. I froze, gripping a branch, heart hammering. It tilted its head, observing, assessing. Then, almost imperceptibly, it retreated into the shadows. I realized the terrifying truth. These feral people were not random. They were methodical, cunning, and patient hunters. Every step we took, every whisper we made was part of a test. Survival depended on awareness, stealth, and caution. Raven's Hollow didn't forgive mistakes. It punished them. We moved cautiously, following a faint trail that seemed to lead out of the hollow. The whispers persisted, low and guttural, like the forest itself warning us to leave. Shadows moved with a purpose, gliding through the trees, never exposing themselves fully, but always present. A sudden movement above us. A figure perched on a tree limb, pale and elongated, tilting its head unnaturally, observing our progress. The intelligence behind its gaze was terrifying, and I realized we were not merely intruding. We were being measured, evaluated. Branches snapped in the distance, the sound amplified in the silent forest. More figures emerged, crouched low, moving with impossible speed and coordination. The forest was alive with their presence, every movement deliberate, calculated. I gripped my branch tighter, knowing it would do little against them. Our only hope was to leave without drawing attention, to move silently, and predictably. But the forest had other plans, and I understood the depth of the danger we faced. Raven's Hollow had claimed us as trespassers, and the hunt had only just begun. The trail twisted sharply, leading to a small creek. Moonlight reflected on the water, casting faint shadows across the rippling surface. But even here, the figures were present, crouched along the banks, their hollow eyes following our every step. The whispers grew louder, now forming almost coherent phrases, like warnings we couldn't comprehend. The forest was no longer just a setting. It was an extension of the feral people, a living entity guiding and manipulating them. One figure moved closer, gliding almost silently, limbs bent unnaturally, eyes locked on me. I froze, every muscle tense, waiting for an attack that never came. Instead, it tilted its head and retreated, as if testing our reactions. I realized that the feral people weren't impulsive. They were strategic, patient, and territorial. Raven's Hollow wasn't a place to explore. It was a trap, designed to teach intruders a terrifying lesson. The forest, the cabin, the symbols, they were all part of a predator's perfect environment. Finally, the trail widened into an old logging path, a possible escape route. I could feel relief rising, but the presence of the feral people remained heavy, oppressive. Shadows shifted, rustling leaves, almost imperceptible movements surrounding us. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw one leap from the tree line onto the path ahead. Its limbs were grotesquely elongated, face twisted, eyes hollow and unblinking. It didn't attack, but the intelligence in its gaze was terrifying, as if it understood our every thought. We moved faster, keeping our heads low, trying to remain unnoticed. Every sound, every breath, every glance was calculated. They didn't need to chase us aggressively. Their patience was enough to ensure we would make a mistake. The cabin, the symbols, the forest. It all made sense now. Raven's Hollow wasn't abandoned. It was alive with its hidden inhabitants. Feral people who had survived for generations, preying on those foolish enough to wander too far. We were intruders, observed and tested, and the forest had allowed us to leave. This time, we finally reached the edge of the forest as dawn broke. The figures receded into the shadows, the whispers fading with them. Our bodies were exhausted, hands raw from gripping branches, hearts pounding. The forest seemed to exhale, releasing us, but the weight of what we had seen lingered. Even now, years later, I remember the hollow eyes, the grotesque, elongated limbs, the ritualistic symbols on the cabin walls. Raven's Hollow wasn't a legend. It was real, and it was terrifying. I sometimes wonder how many others have stumbled into the hollow and never returned, swallowed by the forest or claimed by its feral inhabitants. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow in the distance reminds me that the hunters are still there, patient and intelligent, guarding their domain. The forest had spared us that night, but it taught a hard lesson. Some places aren't meant for explorers, and some shadows belong entirely to the wilderness. Raven's Hollow had marked us, and we would never forget. My name is Rachel, and this happened during a solo backpacking trip through the remote Appalachian woods. I had heard whispers of Black Pine Hollow, a place locals avoided, claiming feral people lived in the dense thickets. I dismissed the stories until I entered the hollow myself. The trees were impossibly tall, their trunks blackened by age and moss, twisting skyward like gnarled hands. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with a faint metallic scent. Birds were silent, and even the wind seemed hesitant to pass through. That's when I first saw movement. Figures crouched low between the pines, pale and thin, limbs bent unnaturally, gliding through shadows with impossible grace. I froze, heart hammering, as one of them paused, tilting its head unnaturally to study me. Its hollow eyes reflected what little light pierced the canopy, unblinking, unfeeling. The forest seemed to breathe with them, alive, waiting. I realized then that these weren't just legends or tales told to frighten hikers. The feral people of Black Pine Hollow were real, intelligent, and territorial. And I had walked straight into their domain. I forced myself to move forward, careful not to make a sound. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig seemed magnified 100-fold. The figures moved in the shadows, following silently, always observing, never revealing themselves completely. I could hear whispers, soft, guttural, almost human, carried by the wind. They weren't random sounds. They seemed directed at me. A warning, a reminder that I was intruding on their territory. I glanced at the tree trunks and noticed strange symbols etched deep into the bark. Primitive, yet deliberate. Signs of warning and claim. One of the figures emerged partially from the shadows, crouched, with limbs bent unnaturally. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I froze. There was a horrifying intelligence behind its gaze. These weren't mindless creatures. They were hunters, patient and calculating, aware of every movement I made. I realized that escaping Black Pine Hollow would require strategy, not panic. Any misstep could provoke them. The forest itself seemed to move with them, shadows stretching unnaturally, creating paths and concealments that no ordinary human could navigate. I understood then that survival meant blending, anticipating, and never showing fear. As dusk deepened, the hollow became more oppressive. Shadows twisted unnaturally, stretching like living things. I could feel them moving in unison, unseen but present, encircling me. A figure emerged ahead, crouched low, limbs elongated, head tilted unnaturally. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, unblinking, unfeeling. I held my breath, frozen, knowing that any sudden movement could trigger a chase or attack. The forest seemed alive, bending around them, hiding them until they chose to reveal themselves. I understood then that the feral people weren't just territorial. They were intelligent, patient, and terrifyingly methodical. They could observe without revealing themselves, study without being noticed, and strike only when the timing was perfect. I pressed myself against a tree, trying to make myself part of the shadows. Each step had to be calculated, deliberate, silent. The forest wasn't just hiding them. It was their ally, their hunting ground. I realized that escaping this place meant more than endurance. It meant thinking like them, moving like them, blending into the hollow until I could find a gap, a path to safety. I edged forward cautiously, each step deliberate. The whispers followed me, low and guttural, threading through the trees like a sinister lullaby. They were patient, waiting for a misstep, a moment of fear. Branches scraped against my arms, leaves rustling unnaturally. Figures shifted in the shadows, gliding silently, always present but never fully revealed. I could see their pale faces, grotesque and thin, glimpsed through the trees for brief moments before disappearing again. Then I noticed the carvings, symbols etched deep into tree trunks and rocks along the trail. They were crude but meaningful, almost ritualistic. Each symbol seemed to mark territory or leave instructions, a warning to anyone foolish enough to venture here. One figure stepped into the clearing ahead. Its limbs bent impossibly, its head tilted unnaturally, hollow eyes fixed on me. The intelligence behind its gaze was horrifying. They weren't mindless. They were calculated, aware of every action. I realized that Black Pine Hollow wasn't just forest. It was a living trap, a hunting ground for beings that had survived here for generations. One wrong move could mean I'd never leave. I continued slowly, trying to move without drawing attention. The figures mirrored my steps, unseen but felt, lurking in the shadows, patient and deliberate. Their hollow eyes followed every subtle motion, testing my reactions. Branches creaked above me, shadows shifting with impossible grace. I realized then that these feral people didn't need to attack to control me. They could manipulate the forest itself, using darkness, whispers, and fear to dictate my movements. I spotted more symbols on the trees, deeper, fresher than before. They weren't random. They were warnings, instructions, and markers of territory. Their precision suggested intelligence far beyond mere survival instinct. Suddenly, a figure lunged from the underbrush, crouched low, moving with unnatural speed. Its grotesque pale face twisted in observation rather than aggression. I froze, clutching a branch like a weapon, knowing it would do little. The figure paused, studying, then glided silently back into the shadows. I realized survival depended on patience, observation, and subtlety. The hollow wasn't a place to rush. It was a test, a trap for those who underestimated it. I understood then the terrifying intelligence of these beings. They were hunters born of shadow and forest. I pressed onward, keeping to the narrowest parts of the trail, moving slowly, deliberately. The forest seemed to close in, shadows stretching unnaturally, every sound magnified. I could sense them everywhere but glimpsed only fragments. A pale arm here, a twisted head there, hollow eyes watching from darkness. The whispers intensified, almost forming coherent words I couldn't understand. It was as if the forest itself was speaking through them, warning me, teasing me, testing me. One figure appeared directly ahead, crouched low, limbs bent at impossible angles. Its hollow eyes glimmered faintly, unblinking. I froze, realizing that running might provoke them, but standing still might be equally dangerous. Branches and leaves brushed against my arms as I moved, masking my steps. The figure tilted its head, studied me for a moment, then retreated silently into the shadows. I understood the chilling truth. These feral people weren't merely predators. They were strategic, patient, and terrifyingly intelligent. I had to think like them, move like them, and anticipate every step if I wanted to survive Black Pine Hollow. Night fell, and the forest became a labyrinth of shadows. I could no longer hear birds or wind, only whispers, low and guttural, threading through the trees. Figures shifted silently in the darkness, their pale faces glimpsed briefly before disappearing. I reached a small clearing and paused, trying to catch my breath. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy, casting faint, flickering shadows across the forest floor. Figures emerged from the darkness, crouched, gliding silently, their eyes hollow and unblinking. One stepped forward, observing me intently. Its grotesque limbs moved with impossible grace, its head tilting unnaturally. The intelligence behind its gaze was terrifying. It was not merely watching, it was calculating, learning, understanding me. I realized then that Black Pine Hollow was alive with them. The forest itself a weapon. They didn't need to attack. The environment would do it for them, using shadows, whispers, and fear to control every step I took. I gripped a fallen branch, though I knew it was useless. Survival depended on awareness, patience, and subtlety. One wrong move, and I'd become part of the forest's dark legacy. I edged along the narrow path, careful not to step on twigs or brush leaves. Every movement was amplified in the still night. Figures moved with impossible coordination, appearing and disappearing like phantoms, their hollow eyes always following. The whispers grew louder, almost forming a chant, filling the forest with low, guttural warnings. I saw symbols etched on tree trunks and rocks, some fresh, others weathered. They were marks of ownership, territorial warnings, and ritualistic signs left for generations. One figure appeared closer, crouched low, observing with grotesque intelligence. Its elongated limbs and twisted posture made it look less human and more like a shadow come alive. I realized that the forest wasn't merely their home. It was an extension of them, and they could manipulate it with terrifying precision. I moved carefully, studying every shadow, anticipating their next appearance. Survival was not about speed. It was about blending, thinking, and moving with calculated subtlety. The forest and its feral inhabitants were testing me, watching how I reacted, learning my weaknesses. Finally, I reached a small creek that bisected the trail. Moonlight reflected off the water, illuminating the path, but it also revealed shadows lurking along the banks. Figures crouched and glided silently, observing, always patient. I crossed carefully, trying to mask every sound. The whispers echoed softly, almost like laughter, carried by the wind. More figures emerged from the trees, their movements coordinated, deliberate. Each one seemed to understand the terrain, the shadows, and the forest in a way I could never hope to. I realized then that these feral people were not just survivors. They were masters of their domain. Their intelligence was terrifying, their patience unmatched. The forest itself was their hunting tool, guiding them, concealing them, empowering them. One figure stepped forward, its grotesque pale face illuminated by moonlight, hollow eyes unblinking. I froze, waiting for a sign of aggression, but it merely observed before gliding silently into the shadows. The hunt was ongoing, but tonight I had survived. I emerged from Black Pine Hollow just as dawn broke, the shadows receding, the whispers fading. My body was exhausted, trembling from adrenaline and fear. The forest seemed to release me reluctantly, as though I had survived a test I was never meant to pass. Even now, years later, I remember the hollow eyes, elongated limbs, and grotesque faces of the feral people. The carvings, the whispers, the shadows, they were all real, and they were alive. Black Pine Hollow was not merely a place. It was a sentient trap, a predator's playground. I sometimes wonder how many others have wandered into the hollow and never returned, claimed by its residents or lost to the shadows. Every rustle, every shifting shadow reminds me that the hunt continues. The hollow spared me that night, but it left its mark. I learned a terrifying lesson. Some forests aren't meant for trespassers, and some shadows belong entirely to their own. Black Pine Hollow would never forget me, and I would never forget it. My name is Daniel, and this happened when I joined a small group of hikers exploring Widow's Peak, a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains. Locals avoided the area, whispering about feral people who roamed the abandoned trails, creatures that had survived in isolation for generations. We dismissed the stories, until we ventured deeper than anyone dared. The trail was narrow, overgrown, and winding. The dense forest blocked out most of the sunlight, leaving the path shrouded in shadows. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. That's when I first saw them, pale, emaciated figures flitting between the trees, moving with unnatural speed and grace. Their hollow eyes seemed to pierce through the undergrowth, studying us. I froze, realizing that the legends were true. These were no ordinary humans. They were survivors, hunters and predators perfectly adapted to this environment. Every instinct in my body screamed to flee, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from their gaze. Widow's Peak had revealed its secret, and it was terrifying. We tried to convince ourselves the figures were tricks of light, shadows created by the dense canopy above. But the forest was unnervingly silent. No birds, no wind, no normal forest sounds. Every snap of a twig made us freeze. I noticed the symbols carved into tree trunks and rocks along the trail, primitive, ritualistic, and deliberate. They weren't decorative, they were warnings, signs left by those who had lived here for generations. We were intruders, and the forest was alive with eyes watching us. One figure emerged from the underbrush, crouched low, its elongated limbs bent at unnatural angles. Hollow eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, unfeeling. It paused, almost studying me, before melting back into the shadows. I realized then that these feral people weren't mindless. They were predators with intelligence and patience. Every movement we made was observed, every sound registered. Widow's Peak wasn't just forest. It was a trap, a hunting ground, and we had stumbled into it, unaware. As twilight descended, the forest grew more oppressive. Shadows twisted unnaturally, stretching across the trail like living things. I could feel them moving around us, circling, always present, yet rarely fully revealed. A figure stepped out briefly, crouched low, limbs elongated, head tilted unnaturally. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. I froze, knowing that running might provoke an attack, but standing still felt equally dangerous. Branches scraped my arms as I moved silently, masking my steps. Each movement had to be deliberate. The forest itself seemed to guide these beings, giving them advantage at every turn. I realized that survival required thinking like them, anticipating their actions, blending with the shadows, and avoiding detection. Widow's Peak wasn't merely a location. It was a sentient environment designed to test intruders. Every whispering sound, every flicker of movement reinforced a terrifying truth. The feral people weren't random threats. They were strategists, survivors, and hunters, perfectly adapted to this dark, hidden world. We pressed forward carefully, the whispers intensifying, carried by the wind like ominous messages. The forest seemed alive, its shadows twisting and bending in ways that made it almost impossible to distinguish reality from illusion. Figures glided silently through the trees, their movements coordinated and precise. I glimpsed pale faces twisted grotesquely, eyes hollow, limbs bent unnaturally. They weren't attacking, yet every sense screamed danger. I noticed more symbols etched into the bark and rocks, both old and fresh. They were territorial markers, warnings, and perhaps even ritualistic instructions passed down through generations. These beings weren't just surviving. They were thriving in a system we could never understand. One figure crouched ahead, observing intently. Its hollow eyes locked on mine, unblinking, calculating. The intelligence behind its gaze was terrifying. I gripped a fallen branch, knowing it was useless. But the act gave a sense of control. I realized that the forest, the shadows, and the feral people were part of a single, living ecosystem, all intertwined, all watching, waiting, and prepared to punish intruders. Widow's Peak wasn't forgiving, and I knew it would test every step I took. We continued slowly, every movement measured. The forest seemed to breathe around us, shadows stretching and shifting in response. The figures flitted between the trees, appearing and disappearing like phantoms, always observing. The whispers became more distinct, guttural and almost intelligible, like warnings or commands. It was as if the forest and its inhabitants were communicating, coordinating to ensure we stayed within their boundaries. Branches snapped above and behind us. A figure lunged from the shadows, crouched low, moving with unnatural speed. Its grotesque pale face twisted, elongated limbs ready to strike, or perhaps just to observe. I froze, gripping my branch as if it offered protection. Then it paused, tilting its head, and retreated silently into the shadows. I realized the feral people didn't need to attack. They relied on fear and control, teaching intruders the consequences of trespassing. Widow's Peak wasn't merely home to predators. It was an intricate, living labyrinth designed to test, trap, and manipulate. Our survival depended on patience, awareness, and a constant study of the shadows around us. One mistake, one careless step, and the forest would claim us as it had claimed others before. Night descended fully, turning the forest into a maze of dark shapes. Every sound echoed unnaturally, leaves rustling, twigs snapping, whispers threading through the air. The figures moved silently, appearing briefly before vanishing. I followed the trail, careful not to attract attention, knowing they could be anywhere. Pale faces flickered in the shadows, limbs bent grotesquely, hollow eyes tracking every step. They weren't mindless. They were strategic hunters, and the forest amplified their advantage. A figure emerged closer, crouched and twisted, head tilting unnaturally. Hollow eyes glimmered faintly. I froze, unsure if movement or stillness would provoke them. The forest itself seemed to shift, hiding and revealing them at will. I understood the chilling reality. Widow's Peak wasn't just dangerous. It was sentient, alive with predators perfectly adapted to the shadows and testing me. Survival depended on blending with the environment, reading the forest, and never underestimating its inhabitants. I gripped a branch, though it was useless, and continued slowly, calculating each step as if the forest itself was a game of life and death. We came across a small clearing where the moonlight barely penetrated the canopy. The shadows danced along the undergrowth, and I could see figures crouched and gliding silently between trees. Their hollow eyes reflected the faint light, unblinking and calculating. I realized then that Widow's Peak was alive with intelligence. Every movement, every whisper, every shadow orchestrated to control intruders. We were not merely walking through a forest. We were navigating a predator's domain. A figure stepped into the moonlight, grotesque and elongated, its head tilted unnaturally. Its gaze was fixed on me, studying my every reaction. I froze, recognizing that any rash move could end in disaster. Branches scraped my arms as I moved, masking my footsteps. Figures mirrored me, unseen but ever present. Their patience was terrifying, their intelligence unimaginable. They didn't need to strike. They could manipulate the environment, shadows, and fear to achieve the same result. I pressed forward cautiously, realizing survival wasn't about courage. It was about calculation, patience, and learning to move as they did. Widow's Peak would not forgive mistakes. We continued along the narrow trail, careful with every step. Shadows seemed to shift with intent, figures gliding silently between trees. The whispers grew louder, guttural, almost forming phrases I couldn't understand. Symbols carved into bark and rocks became more frequent, fresh, and deliberate. These were warnings, instructions, and territorial markers. The forest itself seemed alive with purpose, guiding its inhabitants, controlling intruders. One figure stepped out, crouched low, observing me with grotesque precision. Hollow eyes fixed, limbs bent unnaturally. I froze, realizing survival depended on blending with shadows, anticipating their movements. and never revealing fear. Branches scraped against my arms, masking my footsteps, while other figures watched silently from the tree line. Widow's Peak wasn't just forest. It was a sentient hunting ground, alive with feral predators that had mastered every aspect of their domain. I pressed on, heart pounding, calculating every movement. One misstep, one careless glance, and I would be part of its dark history, another lost soul claimed by the forest and its hidden hunters. Finally, the trail led to a creek reflecting faint moonlight. Shadows pooled along its banks, figures crouched and gliding silently, observing every step. I knew they were testing me, gauging my reactions, waiting for a mistake. I crossed carefully, masking each footstep. The whispers carried across the water, almost like laughter, faint and chilling. Figures emerged from the tree line, pale, grotesque, limbs bent unnaturally, eyes hollow and unblinking. One stepped onto the trail ahead, head tilted, observing. Its intelligence was horrifying. It wasn't hunting recklessly, but analyzing, calculating. The forest itself seemed to bend to its will, guiding the figures, hiding them, controlling every movement. I pressed forward, every sense alert, knowing survival depended on patience, subtlety, and awareness. The forest and its inhabitants were a single, living organism, orchestrating a terrifying game that I barely understood. The moonlight reflected on the creek as I moved. I had survived the encounter for now, but the experience left me shaken. Understanding that Widow's Peak and its feral inhabitants would not forget me, I emerged from Widow's Peak at dawn, exhausted, trembling, my senses still on high alert. The shadows receded, and the whispers faded into silence, leaving only the sound of the wind and birds returning to the forest. Even years later, I can't forget the hollow eyes, grotesque faces, and elongated limbs of the feral people. The forest, the symbols, the shadows, they were real and alive. Widow's Peak was not just a place. It was a living predator, a labyrinth designed to test intruders, and I had barely survived its trial. I sometimes wonder how many others wandered these trails and never returned, lost to the forest or claimed by its inhabitants. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow across the path, reminds me that the hunt continues. The hollow had spared me, but it left its mark. I had learned a hard lesson. Some forests belong entirely to the shadows, and some predators are more cunning than any human can imagine. Widow's Peak would remember me, and I would never forget it. My name is Emily, and this happened during a solo expedition to Ravenwood Ridge, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The ridge was infamous among locals, whispered to be inhabited by feral people, outsiders who had survived for generations, hidden from civilization. I thought it was just a story, until the moment I entered the dense forest. The trail quickly became overgrown, twisting between ancient trees that blocked out the sunlight. The air was thick and damp, smelling faintly of decay and earth. Then I saw them. Figures crouched low between the trees, pale and emaciated, limbs unnaturally bent, gliding through shadows with an eerie silence. Their hollow eyes reflected the dim light, unblinking, studying me with intelligence and patience. My heart hammered as I froze, realizing these were no ordinary people. They were predators, perfectly adapted to the forest, territorial and dangerous. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, mesmerized and terrified. Ravenwood Ridge had revealed its secret, and I had walked straight into a nightmare. I tried to convince myself the figures were illusions, shadows twisted by the dim forest light. but the silence of Ravenwood Ridge was unnatural. No birds, no wind, only the faint rustle of leaves, as if the forest itself was watching. I noticed crude symbols carved deep into tree trunks, almost ritualistic, like warnings left by those who had claimed this place as their own. Every step I took seemed to echo unnaturally, drawing the attention of the unseen watchers. A figure stepped from the underbrush, crouched low, limbs unnaturally bent, head tilted in a grotesque manner. Its hollow eyes locked on mine. I froze, realizing that running might provoke an attack, but standing still could be just as dangerous. These were no ordinary humans. Their patience, intelligence, and knowledge of the forest were terrifying. Each movement I made was calculated, observed, and analyzed. Ravenwood Ridge wasn't merely dangerous. It was alive with predators who had mastered the shadows and the terrain over generations. Twilight deepened, and the forest grew oppressive. Shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting across the trail like living things. Figures moved silently in and out of the darkness, flitting between trees, always watching, always patient. One figure stepped into view, crouched, elongated limbs bent grotesquely, head tilted unnaturally. Its hollow eyes glimmered faintly, unblinking. I froze, realizing that the forest itself seemed to obey them, revealing and concealing them at will. Branches brushed my arms as I moved, forcing me to calculate every step. I understood then that these feral people didn't need to attack to control me. They could manipulate shadows, sound, and fear itself to assert dominance. Every whisper, every flicker of movement, reminded me of the terrifying intelligence of these beings. Ravenwood Ridge wasn't just a trail. It was a sentient labyrinth, designed to challenge, confuse, and terrify intruders. Survival depended on patience, awareness, and blending with the environment. Any misstep could prove fatal. We edged forward cautiously, every movement deliberate. The whispers grew louder, low and guttural, threading through the underbrush like sinister voices. Shadows twisted with an unnatural intelligence, bending around us as though guiding the figures' movements. Figures glided between trees, appearing and disappearing like phantoms, their pale faces grotesque, eyes hollow and unblinking. They didn't attack directly. Their mere presence was enough to instill fear and confusion. Symbols carved into the bark of trees and rocks became more frequent, fresh, and precise. They were territorial markers, instructions, warnings, evidence of a community that had thrived in isolation for generations. One crouched ahead, studying me with unblinking, hollow eyes. Its elongated limbs and twisted posture created an almost unnatural silhouette. I gripped a fallen branch, realizing it would do little against them. Ravenwood Ridge wasn't just a forest. It was a predator's playground. Each figure, each shadow, each whispered sound was part of a larger, intelligent system designed to test, terrify, and control intruders. I knew that survival would demand patience, observation, and blending into the darkness. Night fell, swallowing the forest in near complete darkness. Shadows became denser, almost tactile, stretching and bending unnaturally around the trail. Every sound, branches snapping, leaves rustling, was magnified, alerting the unseen watchers. Figures moved silently, appearing and disappearing between trees, pale faces twisted grotesquely, eyes hollow and unblinking. They studied us carefully, assessing every step, every reaction. Their patience was terrifying. The symbols carved into the bark became more numerous and intricate, marking the territory with precision. The forest seemed alive, aiding its inhabitants in monitoring, testing, and controlling intruders. One figure lunged from the shadows, crouched low, moving with unnatural speed. Its grotesque face twisted, hollow eyes fixed on me. I froze, heart pounding, knowing that even a minor panic could spell disaster. It paused, tilted its head, and retreated silently into the darkness. The forest itself seemed to sigh, as if approving the lesson taught. Fear could be controlled, intruders could be manipulated, survival depended on wits, not strength. We continued along the narrow trail, every step measured. Shadows twisted unnaturally, figures flitting in and out of view, their hollow eyes always tracking us. Whispers carried through the air, almost forming recognizable words. Warnings or commands we couldn't understand. The carvings became more frequent, some fresh, others weathered, marking paths and territories. It was a silent, intelligent system of communication among the feral people. A figure appeared closer, crouched low, elongated limbs bent grotesquely. Hollow eyes fixed on me, unblinking, analyzing. The forest seemed to respond to its movements, revealing or concealing it at will. I understood then that the inhabitants had mastered their environment, using every shadow, whisper, and symbol to control the intruders. Branches scraped my arms as I edged along the trail, blending my movements with the forest. Survival depended on patience, observation, and subtlety. Any misstep would be fatal. The ridge was testing us, calculating our reactions and teaching us lessons in fear and restraint. We reached a small clearing, dimly lit by moonlight piercing through the dense canopy. Shadows pooled along the edges, figures crouched and glided silently between the trees, observing with hollow, unblinking eyes. I realized then that Ravenwood Ridge was alive with intelligence. Every shadow, every whisper, every movement was orchestrated to control us. The forest itself had become an extension of the feral people, a living labyrinth of traps, fear, and observation. One figure stepped forward, grotesque and elongated, head tilted unnaturally. Its gaze was fixed on me, calculating, analyzing. I froze, understanding that any sudden movement could end in disaster. Branches scraped my arms as I carefully advanced, trying to mask my presence. Other figures mirrored my movements from the tree line, coordinated and patient. They didn't need to strike. They manipulated the shadows and the environment to achieve the same effect. I pressed forward cautiously, heart pounding. Survival wasn't about courage. It was about calculation, patience, and understanding the rules of this dark, twisted place. We navigated a narrow section of the trail, every step deliberate. The shadows shifted with unnerving intelligence. Figures gliding silently, appearing and disappearing in a carefully choreographed pattern. The whispers grew louder, guttural, almost forming phrases I couldn't comprehend. Symbols carved into trees and rocks became more frequent, some fresh, others worn by time. These markings were territorial, ritualistic, and precise, evidence of generations who had claimed this forest as their domain. A figure crouched low, head tilted unnaturally, observing me intently. Hollow eyes, unblinking. I realized survival depended on subtlety, blending with the shadows and anticipating their next moves. Branches scratched my arms as I advanced slowly. Other figures watched silently from the tree line. Ravenwood Ridge wasn't just forest. It was a sentient hunting ground, a predator's playground, and a classroom of fear. I pressed forward, alert, calculating every motion. One misstep could prove fatal. The ridge had claimed many, and I knew the hunt was ongoing. Eventually, we reached a creek reflecting faint moonlight. Shadows pooled along the banks, figures crouched and gliding silently, observing every movement. I understood they were testing me, learning my reactions, waiting for the slightest misstep. I crossed slowly, masking every sound. The whispers carried across the water, faint, chilling, almost like laughter. Figures emerged from the tree line, pale, grotesque, limbs bent unnaturally, eyes hollow and unblinking. One stepped onto the trail ahead, grotesque, elongated, head tilted unnaturally. Its gaze was intelligent and calculating. The forest seemed to bend around it, aiding in concealment, guiding its movements, amplifying fear. Every step was a negotiation with shadows. Survival depending on observation, patience, and understanding the rules of this predator's domain. The ridge was alive, and the feral people were its guardians, hunting not through brute force, but through manipulation, fear, and intelligence. I moved cautiously, heart pounding, knowing the forest and its inhabitants could claim me at any moment. At dawn, I emerged from Ravenwood Ridge, exhausted, trembling, and haunted. Shadows receded, the whispers faded, leaving only the gentle wind and returning bird songs. Even years later, I can't forget the hollow eyes, grotesque faces, and elongated limbs of the feral people. The forest, the carvings, the shadows. They were real and alive. Ravenwood Ridge wasn't just a location. It was a sentient predator, a living labyrinth, and I had barely survived its trial. I often wonder how many others entered these woods and never returned, lost to the forest or claimed by its inhabitants. Every rustle, every shifting shadow, every faint whisper reminds me the hunt continues. The ridge spared me, but it left its mark. I learned a terrifying truth. Some forests belong entirely to the shadows, and some predators are far smarter and more patient than any human can imagine. Ravenwood Ridge would remember me, and I would never forget it. My name is Lucas, and this happened when I decided to investigate Blackwood Hollow, an isolated area in the Appalachian Mountains. Locals spoke in hushed tones about feral people living there, outsiders who had survived for generations, shunning civilization and preying on anyone who entered their territory. I didn't believe the stories until I stumbled upon the hollowed cabin. The cabin was small, decrepit, hidden among dense trees and thick underbrush. Its wooden walls were weathered and rotting, yet someone or something had maintained signs of life. Inside, the air was damp and smelled faintly of decay. Strange symbols were etched into the walls and floorboards, ritualistic in nature. Then I saw movement. Pale figures with grotesquely elongated limbs lurked in the shadows. Their hollow eyes reflected the dim light, unblinking, studying me with patient, predatory intelligence. They didn't move like humans. They slithered, crouched, and glided with unnatural agility. I froze, heart pounding. I realized the legends were true. The feral people of Blackwood Hollow were real, and I had just entered their domain. Every step I had taken, every sound I made, had been observed. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing: shadows twisting in the cabin, the faint flicker of movement between broken floorboards. But the silence was unnatural. No wind, no creaking of trees, just the faint whispers of something alive, observing. Symbols carved into the wood glowed faintly in the dim light, primitive yet deliberate. They weren't decorative, they were warnings, territorial markers, and possibly instructions. I realized that anyone who entered unprepared would pay the price. One figure emerged from the shadows, crouched low, limbs bent at impossible angles. Its hollow eyes bore into mine. I froze, knowing that sudden movement could provoke an attack. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the cabin itself were breathing. I understood then that these feral people weren't mindless. They were predators with intelligence and patience, trained by generations surviving in isolation. Each movement I made was calculated, observed, and analyzed. The cabin was no longer a simple structure. It was a living trap, a theater for fear, orchestrated by the hidden inhabitants of Blackwood Hollow. I had stumbled into a nightmare, and escape was not guaranteed. Twilight deepened outside, but inside the cabin, shadows seemed to grow heavier, darker, almost solid. Figures slithered and crouched along the edges of the room, pale faces twisted, hollow eyes reflecting faint light. I moved cautiously, gripping a broken chair as if it offered protection. But I knew it was futile. The air was filled with whispers, guttural and almost intelligent, carried by the currents of the cabin, warning me or perhaps taunting me. The symbols on the walls became more detailed, almost telling a story of the cabin's inhabitants, hunters, survivors, and predators perfectly adapted to the shadows. Every symbol seemed to be a message, a lesson for intruders. A figure stepped closer, crouched low, head tilted unnaturally, observing me. Hollow eyes locked onto mine. I froze, heart hammering. The intelligence in its gaze was terrifying. It wasn't random aggression. It was calculation, strategy, a silent test of my resolve. I realized that survival depended on patience, awareness, and blending with the environment. The hollowed cabin wasn't merely dangerous. It was sentient in its own way, alive with feral predators, and I was trapped in its dark embrace. I edged toward the cabin's exit, careful with each step. Shadows shifted unnaturally, figures appearing and vanishing between the beams and corners. Each whisper carried a sense of menace, a reminder that I was being watched constantly. The carvings seemed to pulse, almost alive, telling a story of generations who had mastered survival in this isolated hollow. It became clear that these feral people didn't need to attack. Fear was their weapon. A figure lunged from the shadows, limbs elongated, grotesque face tilted unnaturally. Hollow eyes locked onto me. I froze, gripping the broken chair tighter. It paused, tilting its head, as if judging my reactions, before disappearing silently into the darkness. I understood then that the cabin itself was a predator, a sentient space amplified by the inhabitants' knowledge of fear, movement, and environment. Survival wasn't about courage. It was about calculation, patience, and reading every detail in this living trap. Each step toward the exit became a negotiation with the shadows. One misstep, one careless glance, and I would be another lost soul claimed by Blackwood Hollow. Night fell outside, and the cabin grew colder, heavier, oppressive. Shadows pooled along the floor and walls, figures crouched and glided silently, observing every move. The whispers grew louder, almost forming words I couldn't understand. Branches scratched the broken windows, blending with the natural forest sounds, making it impossible to distinguish inside from outside. The carvings along the walls glimmered faintly, ritualistic and deliberate. Each one seemed like a warning, a territorial marker, a lesson left by generations of hidden predators. A figure stepped into the doorway, grotesque and elongated, limbs bending at unnatural angles. Hollow eyes studied me with terrifying intelligence. I froze, realizing that any sudden movement could end everything. The cabin itself seemed alive, almost as if breathing, shifting in response to its inhabitants' presence. I understood that the feral people of Blackwood Hollow didn't just survive. They dominated. Their knowledge of fear, patience, and environment turned the cabin into a deadly labyrinth. Survival required subtlety, observation, and understanding of the shadows. Any rash movement, and I would become part of the hollow's legacy. I moved along the cabin's narrow hallway, each step deliberate, branches and debris underfoot masking my sound. Shadows seemed to shift with intent, figures gliding silently, appearing and disappearing in coordinated patterns. The whispers became more distinct, guttural, almost like warnings or instructions. I noticed fresh carvings along the walls, symbols more precise, almost intelligent in design. These were territorial markers, lessons and signs of generations surviving in isolation. A figure crouched near the floor, head tilted unnaturally, observing me with hollow eyes. I froze, understanding that the intelligence behind their gaze was horrifying. They weren't hunting blindly. They analyzed, calculated, and manipulated fear itself. Branches scraped my arms as I moved, forcing me to blend into the environment. The cabin wasn't just a place. It was a sentient predator, alive with coordinated, patient hunters. Survival depended on patience, observation, and avoiding mistakes. Every step became a silent negotiation with the shadows. One careless movement, and I could be claimed. Another lost soul in Blackwood Hollow. I reached a small back room where moonlight barely penetrated. Shadows pooled along the walls, figures crouched and glided silently, eyes hollow and unblinking. The whispers grew louder. A symphony of menace, testing me, watching my reactions. The carvings here were intricate, almost alive, telling a story of survival, dominance, and fear. Each mark was a lesson for intruders, evidence of generations who had mastered isolation and control. One figure stepped closer, grotesque and elongated, head tilted unnaturally, observing me with unflinching eyes. I froze, recognizing that their intelligence made them far more dangerous than any predator I had ever imagined. The cabin itself seemed to breathe, shifting subtly as if alive. I realized that the feral people didn't need to strike. They could manipulate shadows, sound, and fear to achieve the same result. Survival depended on patience, awareness, and subtlety. Every step toward the exit felt like a negotiation with a living entity, a predator, and its cohort of skilled hunters. One wrong move, and the hollow would claim me. I continued slowly along the hallway, every step deliberate. The shadows shifted unnaturally, figures gliding silently, appearing and disappearing with terrifying precision. The whispers were almost intelligible, warnings or commands, carried through the cabin like a chorus of judgment. The carvings became more detailed, fresher, marking paths and territory with intelligence. A crouched figure observed me from a corner, head tilted unnaturally, hollow eyes fixed on me. I understood that my survival depended on blending with shadows, anticipating movements, and remaining calm. Branches scraped my arms as I moved silently. Other figures watched from the dark corners. The hollowed cabin wasn't merely a building. It was a sentient hunting ground, alive with predators perfectly adapted to the environment. Every movement was a silent negotiation with shadows. One misstep, and I would become another lost soul in Blackwood Hollow. Finally, I reached the main doorway. Moonlight filtered faintly through broken boards, revealing the overgrown forest beyond. Shadows pooled along the edges, figures crouched and glided silently, observing my every move. I crossed carefully, masking my steps. The whispers carried faintly across the threshold, almost like laughter, chilling in their intensity. Figures emerged from the cabin's edges, pale, grotesque, limbs bent unnaturally, hollow eyes unblinking. One stepped onto the porch, grotesque and elongated, head tilted unnaturally. Its gaze was intelligent, calculating, almost sentient. The cabin itself seemed to bend around it, aiding concealment, amplifying the fear. Every step toward freedom was a negotiation with shadows. Survival depended on patience, observation, and understanding the rules of this predator's domain. Blackwood Hollow was alive, and its inhabitants were masters of fear. I edged forward, heart pounding, knowing escape was not guaranteed. Every rustle, every flicker of shadow reminded me that the hunt continued even beyond the cabin. At dawn, I finally emerged from Blackwood Hollow, exhausted, trembling, haunted. Shadows receded, whispers faded, leaving only the sounds of wind and returning wildlife. Even years later, I cannot forget the hollow eyes, grotesque faces, and elongated limbs of the feral people. The cabin, the carvings, the shadows, they were real and alive. Blackwood Hollow wasn't just a place. It was a sentient predator, a living labyrinth, and I had barely survived its trial. I often wonder how many others entered the hollow and never returned, lost to the forest or claimed by its inhabitants. Every rustle, every flicker of shadow, every whisper reminds me that the hunt continues. The hollow spared me, but it left its mark. I learned a terrifying truth. Some forests and cabins belong entirely to the shadows, and some predators are far smarter and more patient than any human can imagine. Blackwood Hollow would remember me, and I would never forget it. My name is Sarah, and this happened during a hiking trip to Pinecrest Ridge, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Locals whispered of a hidden hollow inhabited by feral people, outsiders who had survived for generations, entirely cut off from civilization. I didn't believe the stories until the moment I entered the dense, shadowy woods of the ridge. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Twisted trees blocked out most of the sunlight, creating an unnatural gloom. As I followed the overgrown trail, I noticed strange symbols carved into the trunks. Primitive, ritualistic, and unnervingly precise. Then I saw them. Pale figures crouched low between the trees, their limbs elongated and bent at grotesque angles. Hollow eyes reflected the faint light, unblinking, intelligent. They moved silently, gliding between shadows as if the forest itself obeyed their commands. I froze, heart hammering, realizing the stories were true. Pinecrest Ridge wasn't just remote. It was alive with predators who had mastered fear, patience, and the forest itself. Every step I had taken had been observed, every sound analyzed. I tried to convince myself the figures were tricks of the light, shadows twisted by the dense canopy. But the silence of Pinecrest Ridge was unnatural. No birds, no rustling wind, only faint whispers carried through the trees. The carvings along the trunks became more frequent, some fresh, others weathered, forming patterns I couldn't decipher. They weren't decorative, they were warnings, instructions, territorial markers. Whoever, or whatever, lived here wanted intruders to know they were being watched. One figure emerged from the underbrush, crouched low, limbs bent grotesquely, hollow eyes locked onto mine. My heart raced as I froze, realizing that running might provoke them, but staying still could be just as deadly. These weren't ordinary humans. Their patience, intelligence, and knowledge of the forest were terrifying. Every movement I made was noted, every sound analyzed. Pinecrest Ridge was no longer just a forest. It was a living trap, a labyrinth designed to test, terrify, and dominate any intruder. I understood that survival required observation, patience, and blending with the shadows. As twilight fell, shadows deepened unnaturally, twisting along the path. Figures moved silently in and out of view, their pale faces grotesque, hollow eyes unblinking, observing every step I took. I pressed on cautiously, gripping a fallen branch for some sense of security. The whispers grew louder, guttural and almost forming words I couldn't understand. It was as if the forest itself had become a predator, using the feral people as extensions of its will. Symbols carved into the trees seemed to tell a story. Lessons of survival, warnings, and threats. Each mark reinforced that I was trespassing in a territory meticulously maintained by beings who had adapted perfectly to the wilderness. One figure crouched closer, its elongated limbs bent unnaturally, head tilted in a grotesque way. Its hollow eyes locked on mine, calculating. I froze, understanding that panic or sudden movements could be fatal. Pinecrest Ridge wasn't just dangerous, it was alive with intelligence. The feral inhabitants didn't need to attack. They controlled fear itself, bending shadows and sound to assert dominance over intruders. I edged forward, aware that every step was observed. Shadows shifted unnaturally around the twisted trees, figures appearing and disappearing with uncanny precision. The whispers became clearer, guttural and taunting, almost like the forest itself was mocking me. Symbols on the trees multiplied, some freshly carved, others faint from years of weathering. These were not mere decorations. They were territorial warnings, instructions, or records of previous trespassers. One crouched figure stepped closer, head tilted unnaturally, hollow eyes fixed on me. I realized survival wasn't about courage. It was about patience, awareness, and blending with the environment. Branches scraped my arms as I carefully advanced, calculating each step. The figures mirrored my movements, gliding silently between the trees. Pinecrest Ridge wasn't simply a forest. It was a sentient predator, and its feral inhabitants were masters of fear and control. I pressed on, knowing any misstep could spell disaster. Every movement was a negotiation with shadows, and every shadow was alive with intent. The ridge was testing me, evaluating my reactions and teaching terrifying lessons in patience, observation, and survival. Night settled fully, and the forest grew oppressive. Shadows pooled unnaturally, wrapping around trees and trails, figures crouched and gliding silently. The whispers intensified, guttural, sinister, almost like they were speaking directly to me. The carvings on the trunks were now everywhere, fresh and precise, marking territory, leaving warnings, and perhaps chronicling generations of feral life hidden from the world. It became clear that these beings didn't need to attack to dominate. They used fear as a weapon. A figure lunged from the shadows, elongated limbs moving inhumanly, grotesque face twisted, head tilted unnaturally. Hollow eyes locked on me. I froze, knowing that even a minor panic could provoke them. Branches scraped my arms as I tried to blend with the darkness. Other figures watched silently from the tree line. Pinecrest Ridge wasn't just a place. It was a living, intelligent predator, and its inhabitants were perfectly adapted to the shadows and terrain. I pressed on cautiously, heart pounding, fully aware that escape depended on patience, observation, and understanding the ridge's twisted rules. The narrow trail twisted deeper into the forest, each step deliberate. Shadows moved unnaturally, figures appearing and disappearing, watching my every action. The whispers were louder now, more distinct, almost like intelligible commands or warnings carried through the night air. The carvings had become elaborate, fresh and precise, marking paths and territories with intelligence beyond human comprehension. A crouched figure observed me, head tilted unnaturally, hollow eyes fixed on mine. Their intelligence was terrifying, calculated, patient, and aware of every reaction I made. Branches scraped against my arms as I moved slowly, blending with the environment. Pinecrest Ridge wasn't merely a forest. It was a living predator, and the feral inhabitants were masters of manipulating shadows, sound, and fear itself. Every step was a silent negotiation with these sentient predators. One mistake, one sudden movement, and I would become just another lost soul claimed by the ridge. I reached a small clearing illuminated faintly by moonlight. Shadows pooled along the edges, figures crouched and glided silently, their hollow eyes unblinking and calculating. I realized the ridge was alive with intelligence. Every shadow, every whisper, every movement was orchestrated to control intruders. The forest itself had become an extension of the feral inhabitants, a living labyrinth designed to manipulate fear. One figure stepped closer, grotesque and elongated, head tilted unnaturally, eyes fixed on me. I froze, heart hammering. The intelligence in its gaze was terrifying. Branches scraped my arms as I advanced slowly. Other figures mirrored my movements from the tree line, coordinated and patient. They didn't need to attack. They could manipulate shadows and sound to achieve the same effect. I pressed on cautiously, aware that survival was not about bravery, but subtlety and observation. The ridge's test was ongoing, and any misstep could cost my life. I moved through the twisted path, each step deliberate. Shadows shifted unnaturally, figures gliding silently, appearing and disappearing like phantoms. Whispers filled the air, guttural, taunting, almost forming words I couldn't comprehend. The carvings on trees became more numerous and intricate, some freshly etched, marking territory with intelligence. A crouched figure watched me from a dark corner, head tilted unnaturally, hollow eyes fixed on me. Survival depended on blending with shadows, anticipating movements, and remaining calm. Branches scraped against me as I moved. Other figures watched silently from the tree line. Pinecrest Ridge wasn't just a forest. It was a sentient hunting ground, alive with predators perfectly adapted to their environment. Every step became a negotiation with shadows, every movement a test. One careless motion and I would become part of the ridge's legacy. Eventually, I reached the edge of a creek, moonlight reflecting off the water. Shadows pooled along the banks, figures crouched and glided silently, observing every step. I crossed carefully, masking my sound. Whispers floated across the water, faint but chilling, almost like laughter. Figures emerged from the tree line, pale, grotesque, limbs bent unnaturally, eyes hollow and unblinking. One stepped onto the path ahead, grotesque and elongated, head tilted unnaturally, gaze intelligent and calculating. The forest itself seemed to bend around it, aiding concealment and amplifying fear. Every step toward escape was a negotiation with shadows. Survival depended on patience, observation, and understanding the ridge's rules. Pinecrest Hollow was alive, and its feral inhabitants were masters of fear. I edged forward, heart racing, knowing escape was not guaranteed. Every rustle, every flicker of shadow, every whisper reminded me that the hunt continued, even beyond the ridge. At dawn, I emerged from Pinecrest Ridge, exhausted, trembling, and haunted. Shadows receded, whispers faded, leaving only the sounds of the wind and wildlife returning to the hollow. Even years later, I cannot forget the hollow eyes, grotesque faces, and elongated limbs of the feral people. The carvings, shadows, and whispers, they were real and alive. Pinecrest Ridge wasn't just a forest. It was a sentient predator, a living labyrinth, and I had barely survived its trial. I often wonder how many others entered the hollow and never returned, lost to the forest or claimed by its inhabitants. Every rustle, flicker of shadow, or faint whisper reminds me the hunt continues. The ridge spared me, but it left its mark. I learned a terrifying truth. Some forests belong entirely to shadows, and some predators are far smarter, more patient, and more intelligent than any human can imagine. Pinecrest Ridge would remember me, and I would never forget it. As the shadows of Appalachia fade with the dawn, one truth becomes undeniable. Some forests, mountains, and hidden hollows are alive with predators we can barely comprehend. The 10 disturbing encounters you just witnessed are more than stories. They are glimpses into the terrifying reality of feral people, living hidden in the wilderness, mastering fear, patience, and survival far beyond our understanding. From the hollowed cabin of Blackwood Hollow to the whispering hollow of Pinecrest Ridge, each tale reminds us that isolation can breed monsters, and that the human mind is not always prepared for what hides in the dark. The whispers, the hollow eyes, and the elongated figures are etched into memory, leaving a chilling reminder that danger often lurks where we least expect it. If these stories unsettled you, that means you felt the fear as it was intended, intense, personal, and haunting. Remember, some shadows are better left unexplored. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the darkest corners of Appalachia. Stay vigilant, stay aware, and never ignore the whispers in the woods. Thanks for watching. This was Dark Fears.